2008. Remember that? That was a huge, colossal mistake.
A lot of times when you look at anyone who's a master of any craft, there's the rule, the 10,000 hour rule.
The universe was telling me that I need to be involved.
FTX was one of those companies that,
the big banks, they all formed .coms versions of themselves.
Hello, everybody. My name is William Senasegi. I'm joined here by the CEO of Soluna, John Belizaire. Man, you have had an incredible journey up until and before Soluna. So why don't you talk about that journey and what brought you into crypto, and then we can dive into everything Bitcoin.
Oh, absolutely. I've been an entrepreneur and CEO for about 20 plus years now. I think this November was the 23rd anniversary of the sale of my first company. So I've really been passionate about building teams that are focused on solving really hard problems. And what I find as I look back is there's a bit of a pattern in my entrepreneurial experience. It's always about focused on the confluence between big technology waves and their role or intersection with legacy industries. So my first business was focused on the role that the internet would have on the financial services industry. So we built e-commerce platforms and banking platforms for banks and taking their businesses online. Later, I helped to digitize the enterprise, providing a series of tools for companies to do that. And then I ventured into the insurance industry that is sort of tends to adapt technology quite late. And they suddenly were rushing to bring all forms of technology, social media, data and analytics, AI to their businesses. And I ran a company that helped to make underwriting a much more repeatable and data powered process. And so Soluna is really a continuation of that theme, I guess. It's a confluence between a fast moving, hard to understand technology called blockchain and Bitcoin and crypto, and its relationship with a transformational phase of a very large industry, and that's renewable energy. And those two things intersecting and two circles creates a lot of interesting opportunities. And Soluna is specifically focused on eliminating the wasted energy problem and using that to catalyze deeper integration of renewables into the grid and ultimately making green energy and renewable energy a global superpower. That's been my journey. I talk a lot about my experience as CEO, the challenges, the opportunities, the learnings, etc. I write it on my personal blog, and I incorporate it into some of the things that I talk about when I work with the team here. So it's always exciting to get the opportunity to continue to share that. So that's how I worked my way all the way to this experience. How I actually got into Soluna was an interesting story. The CEO of our parent company, Soluna Holdings, Michael Toporek, he was actually an investor in a number of my companies, was on my board, my last company. And he suggested I come look at a project he was working on. It actually was a project in Morocco. That's where our journey started, where my colleagues and I developed a project to harness probably one of the best wind resources in the world. We were having difficulty developing the project because the grid wasn't ready to accept the magnitude of power that our wind farm would produce. And in our research, we found a solution for this problem. It actually occurred to us that computing in the blockchain was perfect to solve that issue. And we immediately deployed the solution to sort of absorbing this excess clean energy. And so we architected it to do that. And once we identified this solution, we realized it was unlikely we were the only people to have this challenge. And so our journey to eradicate curtailed energy started from there. And it turns out it's a big problem. So that's the full journey.
Wow, that's incredible. Very few people out there can say that they've had that much experience as a CEO. So I'm very curious, just what are some of the biggest things that you learned? A lot of times when you look at anyone who's a master of any craft, there's the rule, the 10,000 hour rule. And I mean, over that many years being a CEO, I'm sure that you've come across some huge lessons. You probably had some big challenges. So, I mean, are there any stories that you have or any battle scars that you've been through that you're willing to share here on the podcast?
Well, there are lots of them. It probably would take up more time than we have on the podcast. But what I can say is that I've been an entrepreneur, as I said, for over 2 decades, and one thing that I've noticed is that being CEO is more about your habits than your actions. Over time, as you make mistakes, and some of those mistakes will be original mistakes, and some of them will not. And what you want to optimize for is getting those mistakes to fundamentally be original. It's okay if you make mistakes as long as they're original. And you want to find ways to essentially eliminate those unforced errors, if you will, using a little tennis parlance. But as Aristotle put it, what we repeatedly do is what we are. Excellence, therefore, is not an act, it's a habit. So getting better at the job is really about developing and maintaining better habits. And habits are important because the job just changes over time. I think that's the key thing that I've learned over the years is I'm changing as an individual. The role is changing as the company evolves and grows and its needs change. You start out by getting involved in just about everything. Like you're in the weeds and you quickly grow into a leader, and then you ascend into becoming a coach. And during those transitions, you must constantly improve your skills every day. I learned this very early on my CEO journey. I went to visit a bunch of CEOs that were in Boston, where my first company was located. This was before the internet, so you really couldn't find anybody so easily, by searching on LinkedIn or something like that to look at your network. So I had this university guidebook, which basically listed all of the alumni and where they were and how to contact them. And I looked up, CEOs that were in the local Boston area that had gone to the same university that I went to. And I called them all cold saying, hey, you got to help me because I have no idea what I'm doing. It's my first company. Where do I start? How do I raise money? Who do I talk to? How do I build a network? All of those kind of things. And a number of them graciously sat with me and taught me a lot of what they learned, shared some of their battle scars. And they taught the importance of focus and really building up a set of habits and mechanics to be a CEO. And if I had the opportunity to go through a list here, it'd be sizable, but I'll hit a few of them. One is just make sure your decisions are slower over time and better, right? Especially decisions that are really, really consequential decisions. The inconsequential ones, you should make them quickly, and ideally you shouldn't make them at all. Someone else in your team should. You want to have a real good process for hiring and firing people. And you do need to have meetings. As much as we hate going to meetings, I hate going to meetings. But if you're running the right meetings, you can achieve a lot. You should take time to learn from your failures and pain from those failures. I have a lot of them. And I think each one has made me a better CEO over time. And you should take time for solitude and rest. Connect with customers. So many CEOs avoid going to spend time with customers or whoever your constituents are. In our case, it's renewable energy power plant owners, spending time with all of the power plant owner companies and related parties, et cetera, the utilities, the grid operator. Get some sleep. Will, I know, you're partying all night and everything, but these days I go to bed early. I have to. It's the only way to have the energy that I need to, sustain the role. Being empathetic with your team, really connecting with their emotions and their feelings, staying present as much as you can. We are often gripped by anxiety. And I think number 10 would be just coaching your team. Spend time helping them become better leaders. That's what I would share are my main learnings as a CEO and what it means to go through a process of mastery. There's a phrase in Japanese called shokunin, and it basically means the endless pursuit of perfection for some greater good. The greater good that we do as CEOs is sort of creating something that can really make a positive change in the world, and creating a place that people can come to and feel that they're growing and that they're happy and they're doing their best and they're in flow, right? And it takes a continuous process of honing and tuning and improving that place to make it so. So that's what I'm focused on.
That's great advice. And I think that a lot of those lessons that you just shared, it's common to hear that as leaders, it's hard to find enough time in the day to go and juggle everything and to keep everything moving. And think that a lot of those lessons that you've taught are, hey, as the leader, you can't go and do everything. You've got to find a good way to delegate.
Yeah.
You've got to build a superstar team. You've got to teach your team to become leaders and help them go and build good teams. In the end, you need to get some sleep to make sure that you're making the right, smart, sound decisions.
That's right. You can start again the next day. Mm-hmm.
So before you got introduced with the opportunity for Soluna, had you heard about Bitcoin or crypto as technology? Had you begun to look into it? Or was this something where he said, hey, I know and trust you as a great leader and know you know how to build organizations. So go learn about this and then build the company. What
Good
was
question.
your
Yeah.
approach to it when you first were introduced?
So when he introduced it to me, it was the third time that I had been introduced to Bitcoin. The first time was a longtime colleague of mine. Once a year, we'd get together for lunch up in Boston, and he'd tell me about cool stuff he was working on. And I'd tell him about my misery. No, just kidding. And all of my learnings, I'd say. And then at one point during the lunch, he says, "Have you heard of Bitcoin?" And I said, "I've read some things and in the news about it. Seems a bit shady." And he said, "No, I think it's probably one of the most incredible pieces of technology we've seen in a long time." And I just thought, that's interesting. I kind of parked it, didn't, go dig in a bit further. Just wasn't the time. I was so focused on growing the business that I was running at the time. The second time was in between things. It was sort of sold my last company and I was taking a break, and I happened to be in San Francisco. And I had drinks with one of my original co-founders from my first company. He was there. He had just come back from Burning Man. He was hanging out with some friends and he decided to stay in the city at the time. And I was there for a board meeting. I was on a board of a company that, believe it or not, was focused on tracking pandemic threats. And no one believed them that this was going to be viruses would be a global pandemic anytime soon.
What year is this?
Yeah, this was in 2016, 2017 time frame. And so I was visiting the company for the first time. So he explained to me that he was going to be joining a group that was going to focus on building essentially the equivalent of a crypto ETF at the time. And I said, what is crypto? And he says, things like Bitcoin. And I says, oh yeah, I've heard about this before. What is that exactly? And he and I went to school together. We studied computer science. I have a degree, an undergrad and graduate degree in computer science. And so he described it to me in a computer science fashion. He explained as a distributed ledger, distributed systems, the role of all the different participants on the platform, what mining is, et cetera, et cetera. He had really done a deep dive on it, and he gave me sort of like a mini masterclass. And I was really intrigued. It was one of those sort of like you felt the heat rise in your body, like, whoa, there's something about that. I got to go look at that a little closer. So I did start reading about it a bit. He had sent me a couple of articles to dig into, and I was quite fascinated. But that was the second time. The third time was when Michael and I were riding the subway in New York, and he told me he was working on this project in Morocco, and he had this problem, and he was thinking to solve it with, something called Bitcoin. And I said, well, I actually know what that is. And I said, is it mining? And he was surprised. He's like, you know about that? So the first time I actually knew something, clearly the universe was telling me that I need to be involved in the maturity of this technology and it's going to make some waves. What I didn't realize, I guess, was the impact that it could have on the energy world. And I didn't realize that until I started working and understanding the energy space. And I had to learn everything about the energy business, finance, the technology, the players, the regulations in the country of Morocco and beyond. And then I had to learn everything about Bitcoin, the same thing. How do you finance it? How does the technology work? Who are the participants? What are the regulatory dynamics? And that type of activity draws energy into me. There's this concept where you should really only focus on things that you're really good at and make you happy, right? And the make you happy circle is really about sort of the things that actually draw energy into you, not suck energy out of you. So I find that the reason I have lots of really complex businesses in my entrepreneurial career is because I really like that because I get to learn something new, right? I get to like start from scratch and rebuild. And I'm a lifelong learner. And so I've learned so much about Bitcoin and its impact. And I've learned so much about energy actually and how important energy is in the global economy, actually, in just about every aspect of life. And I also learned the fact that many people, I'm talking about billions of people, do not enjoy energy the way we do here in the West, right? We sort of take energy for granted almost. We plug a toaster in and it's there. The electrons start to flow and we have a nice breakfast. There are other people around the world that are starving that don't have that level of experience. In fact, they're energy poor. And renewable energy is a powerful solution to that problem if you can get it to catalyze anywhere in the world. And by bringing flexible computing like Bitcoin and other types of batchable type processes, we believe that can be made.
The journey of going and learning about a new industry is one thing, and then being in the Bitcoin and crypto universes, especially when you're talking about the regulatory side, the
Yeah.
technology, the different stakeholders, it really is like a never-ending rabbit hole because you learn
It
one
is,
thing
yeah.
and then you realize, okay, well, you answered this one question, but now you have five more questions and you need to go and answer all those to understand how all this works. And so taking a step back and looking at Bitcoin in particular, it seems like you were in a very good position early on getting that masterclass from your friend, the pretty early days. So you knew how mining worked, you had an understanding of the technology. Then I'm assuming that as you've been in the space longer, you've learned more and more about Bitcoin. And as you mentioned, you learned about how energy poor many areas around the world are. So,
Right.
what are some of the things that your mind has changed on in regards to when you first got into it and you first took the role of CEO versus how you look at Bitcoin today?
My initial perception of the technology was that number one, it's possible, the likelihood is low, that this will replace the form of money that we see around the world, right? I felt that there would be unwavering resistance from, sovereign countries around having a technology that they don't control replace the monetary system. But what intrigued me was that someone or some people had cracked incredible amounts of hard code. I mean, I'm talking about problems that I was classically taught that were intractable in the computer science space. And this person elegantly combined those problems and solutions into a really beautiful design that makes trust irrelevant. It's really compelling. And so the question for me was, well, what applications could that have? And so the next thing I thought was that blockchain will have the underlying technology that powers Bitcoin, right, can have broad applications across multiple industries that could eliminate really hard problems in the world, everything from property management, identity management, security challenges, tracking of the movement of materials around the planet in a transparent way, unlocking the circular supply chain and really helping us understand where every product that we use comes from and its effect on the planet. That for me was like really compelling because I felt that, Bitcoin had the potential to be as or if not more impactful than the internet. And that really excited me. And I had a really hard time with focusing on that and this energy thing, which was so new. Like I understood that, like the blockchain, it was software, it's something that I knew, right? It was very innate in my DNA because I'm a computer scientist, so I can start to see a vision of all the different ways in which this technology could take shape. And the next 2 to 3 years, which is sort of like the first part of the Soluna experience, I spent a lot of time learning about energy and energy's role and energy's impact over the last 50 plus years as it has made these incredible transitions using new technology and finding ways to make energy more circular and more sustainable, and how countries struggle with energy security. And as I said, we started in Northern Africa, traveling around Africa and learning more about the broader energy architecture of that continent. It can be demoralizing to see that, energy isn't as ubiquitous as it could be. And that's where my perception of Bitcoin's role started to change a little bit, that it does still have all of the potential that I imagined and others continue to imagine well beyond my capacity. It has incredible potential, both as a store of value, its potential to revolutionize the financial services industry. Every year that it doesn't achieve the fate that all of the naysayers predict, it becomes a more consistent and persistent element of our society, thereby ultimately making it boring. And I think when technology becomes boring is when it's sort of achieved its goal. It has penetrated the world and become a powerful innovation wave. We don't really talk about the internet anymore, do we? We know the internet is there, but we talk about all of the capabilities and technologies that are built on top of the TCP/IP protocol. The same will happen for Bitcoin. It will ultimately not be mentioned at all. It's just going to be part of our natural lexicon. It will be embedded in lots of elements of the financial services industry, in science, and in energy. That's the piece that's changed for me. it has the potential to accelerate and assist the transition from fossil fuel sources of energy that creates all sorts of problems in the world to a world where we use the natural resources that are persistent, that will be for billions of years, to power the planet. And Bitcoin becomes a boring infrastructure element in the energy system, the global grid, if you will, and that will make a lot possible. And that lot is incredible economic growth around the world, an integrated concept of energy, and lots more innovation. There'll be more science and technology that comes into the space. All of that will be potentially catalyzed by one form of computing that we didn't imagine would make any sense whatsoever 15 years ago. And so that's what's changed for me. The role of Bitcoin is much broader and much more powerful than even the authors of the white paper imagined.
It sounds like we've gone down a similar kind of journey, because my views that exactly what you just laid out is a similar journey that I've gone down, going and speaking with many people. And when you begin to understand how the energy sector works and you understand the incentives that underpin Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, I'm not sure if it was initially intended to be this way, but at scale, you have this beautiful system where you have the Bitcoin miners going around the world seeking the cheapest forms of power. And many times, just naturally, the incentives are going to be wasted energy or energy assets that might be underutilized, not being used. And so you have what Brandon Quittem calls the pioneer species of the Bitcoin miners going out and helping bootstrap all these energy assets and helping, as you put it, turn a large portion of the population that's currently energy poor into really making our civilization a more energy rich civilization. So that's one of the things as well that I think is just absolutely beautiful. And I'm curious to hear what your view is on the sustainability aspect and the impact that Bitcoin mining has on renewable energy development. Because many times people outside of the Bitcoin mining circles, they'll criticize and attack Bitcoin mining for its energy use. And I think that it's very important for people to hear from people like you who are actually involved in these projects and understand the energy sector at a deep level, to understand what's actually going on and what's the role between Bitcoin mining and the renewable energy sector.
I think that the key message that listeners should take away is, if you're a listener from the renewable energy business or the energy business and you're trying to understand this, all of this talk about Bitcoin miners coming into Texas and integrating with power plants, what's happening is a innovation wave. It's a wave of two fast-moving technologies coming together to create a 1 + 1 = 2 experience. You're probably going to see some of the largest growth in renewable energy that's ever been seen in a long time, especially since the IRA, the passing of the IRA this year, probably one of the biggest wins, right? It's going to drive a massive amount of investment in the space. And that's going to exacerbate a problem. Number one, the grid was not designed for large amounts of intermittent energy being added to it, right? It was designed to be a synchronous system. The second is, because the system was not designed for, asynchronous activity, it really has this issue where there will be a mismatch between production and consumption and vice versa. And so you have the potential for massive amounts of wasted energy, which will create big problems for energy developers, energy project owners, the grid itself, because transmission and batteries aren't there yet from a scale perspective. And by the way, batteries now have a real challenging environmental issue, right? Because you still have to go mine for the important minerals to make some of these bankable battery systems. And that is no longer in vogue, right? Because we're now focused on sustainability. So what's the solution to that problem? The solution to that problem is essentially building a new type of data center, bringing load to generation. That was the aha that we got during our experience in Morocco. What if you could bring load to generation rather than the other way around? And that's the lateral thinking that's required to build a whole new industry. And so what we've done at Soluna is we've developed an innovative data center that can be co-located with utility scale renewable energy assets like solar and wind and in remote locations. These modular data centers perform crypto mining. They can also perform other forms of compute, scientific compute, blockchain, AI-related computing, and the flexibility of these facilities, they're designed to be flexible. It allows us to create unprecedented demand-side flexibility that matches intermittent power generation in real time. That's the innovation, bringing a load system that's flexible to the generation unit, sensing where there's excess energy and consuming that energy, generating more revenue for that power plant, and retroactively bringing flexibility to the grid is a very powerful technology that's ready today. Every other solution is still in the scaling phase, whereas the architecture that we've developed and other players are developing in the space enables utility scale renewable assets to be built larger. They can interconnect faster and have a higher capacity factor and contribute more to system reliability. That's a very powerful enhancement to today's grid system. That is the promise of technologies like Bitcoin mining that can be done inside of these facilities. Not everybody is building them the way we build them, but the point is that there's a whole new industry that is focused on bringing these additional load capabilities to the grid infrastructure that will play a major role in changing and improving the experience of our energy system such that it's more sustainable. It integrates more green electrons and creates a better balance between load and generation. That is the kind of stuff for me that gives me goosebumps as an entrepreneur, because I have the potential to bring something new and permanent that could really turn things around. And so to the audience that's listening, that's what's driving mining industry. We all want low-cost power. We all want more sustainable green power. Well, I'll say a majority of us want that. And I think that's with everything that's happened with the crypto freeze right now, there's a lot of learning, a lot of licking of wounds. And I think everyone's beginning to realize that, they need to double down on infrastructure. They need to integrate more with facilities. And that's going to change a lot. So that's what I would say to the marketplace is be open, because what's happening is very positive for the industry.
Right now, you just touched on it, it's a crazy time within our industry. And a lot of this has been spurred by a handful of bad actors and a lot of people who are coming in who might not be working in the space full time. You're looking at the prices, the charts, how much these assets are down. And a lot of people, if you don't understand it, it's very difficult to see. It's very scary. And so my question to you would be, what is your take on everything that's been happening in the market? Not just from a price action perspective, but also some of the massive blowups that we've seen with companies that at one point during the heights of the bull market were seen as the big industry giants, the leaders that couldn't be taken down. FTX was one of those companies that kind of came out of nowhere. They grew very, very quickly, and then they became almost like the golden child, looking to be the savior to a lot of these other companies that were going under. And now we've just seen a tremendous amount of hurt, a lot of people losing a lot of money. So with all this drama going on, how are you looking at it and trying to interpret it to make sure that you're making the right decisions around everything?
That's a very great point. Well, here's our perspective. So there's an exercise that we do in our company. It happens once a quarter and in a very deep way once a year. So in our annual planning, we go back to what we call our Soluna playbook. And the Soluna playbook is basically answering a series of questions, everything from the fundamentals, like why do we exist? How do we behave? What is it we do? What's our business? What's important right now? And what do we believe? What do we believe part is basically what are the fundamental assumptions about the market that drive our executive decisions and our view of the world and the role we will play in it. And because of all of these blowups, we went back to the assumptions and asked ourselves, what's different now? What's going to change? And we break them up by category. So we look at renewable energy, we look at finance, anything that touches our business. We look at regulation, and we look at just sort of the crypto environment in general. And you had a lot of things happen over the last 12 to 18 months and in a very acute way over the last 6 months, right? You had Rewind, the movie 18 months ago. You had a very loose monetary policy, lots of capital coming into the system, and that drove a lot of excess income for people, right? And that excess income went into lots of speculative products and services, lots of consumer spending. There was free flowing of capital to begin to build this industry in a very big way for the first time. I mean, you had companies reaching levels of 700 plus megawatts under management. That's unheard of in terms of size. There was, one company that had over 400 megawatts, one facility alone. So you're talking about massive investments. I think all told, there was north of $5 billion plus dollars invested in the industry. And so you saw a massive growth there. There was over trillions of dollars invested in the system overall. And so lots of that went into new forms of digital assets that clearly the SEC and members of our federal government believe were securities. And so there are expectations of what one should expect, right, when you're investing in a security. And there are clear regulatory frameworks that those have to play in. And not all of those securities that were made available for people to invest in, to own, followed those regulatory frameworks. Trust is assumed in the traditional financial system. And so if you are investing in these things, you as a consumer assume trust is there, assume that these companies are following these regulatory frameworks so that you're safe. And in many cases, that was not true. In fact, it was so untrue that you saw effectively mistakes being made that were unoriginal, right? Where you had parties taking capital, creating a product to provide a yield on that capital, right? So capital would be a digital asset, and I provide a yield for you in that asset. And I create that yield by investing in other products and assets and entities and so forth. And they used trust to establish those relationships. They did not use hard underwriting. They did not use really mature compliance and review and Chinese walls between assets, all the things we have come to expect from a financial services provider, because so many bad things have happened over the last several decades, right? All of those learnings and mistakes that were made. 2008, remember that? That was a huge, colossal mistake, right? In fact, it led to the birth of Bitcoin. Those mistakes were made again. Lots of them were made again. And I think what happens is from that pain comes learning. So we're going to see a incredible shift in the regulatory framework. You're going to see more regulation around these types of assets. You're going to see more scrutiny coming from the government. And we've seen this before. That's what happened after the Enron explosion. The government became more involved to understand the internet and technology and digital assets and digital platforms more acutely, and then put in what some might believe are onerous regulations in place, but people felt safe again. So you're going to see more of that. That's in our set of assumptions. You're also going to see what we believe to be massive amounts of consolidation. So many times what happens is a new form of technology takes place. It takes hold. The traditional players say that's not going to affect me. That's just garbage. Don't worry about it. And then suddenly they get so big and explode loud enough that they have to pay attention to them. And they're like, I see what they were trying to do. That actually is pretty helpful to us. We should do that. And so by way of example, let me get my years right. The Super Bowl of 2000, was the first time where you saw 100% pure play online businesses advertise during the Super Bowl. You had companies like Pets.com, Yahoo advertising during the Super Bowl. 2 years later, all of those companies were gone. But in those 2 years, you know what happened? All of the brick and mortar companies, the Walmarts, the Macy's, the big banks, they all formed .coms versions of themselves. And that led to a massive growth in the e-commerce space for the next decade. You know what's going to happen in the next couple of years? The same thing. You're going to see huge new digital asset businesses built under the Goldmans of the world, the Morgan Stanleys, the JP Morgans. And that's what's going to completely mature the industry such that crypto will become boring. That's how we view what's happened this year. It's the catalyzer for massive amounts of maturity in the space.
If you're FTX right now, you're wishing that you were a Pets.com and not a massive fraud.
Yeah, at least you just got a big inventory of socks and you're not going to be wearing,
Yeah, exactly.
government issued socks, Um,
Yeah. So I got one final question for you, and this has been an absolutely incredible conversation. I've learned so much in this. It's been amazing. But before I ask the final question,
mhm.
for everyone out there who's listening, where can they best connect with you or the company on social media?
So we spend a lot of time on Twitter. You can find us at Soluna Holdings on Twitter. We're also on LinkedIn. You can follow our company page, Soluna, at LinkedIn as well. And visit our website. We've got incredible amounts of content. We now have a resource center that integrates all of that content, everything from our podcast. We have our own podcast called Clean Integration, where we discuss some of these topics I've been mentioning, right? We bring on folks who are experts in the industry and we ask them questions, with a seek to learn, intent. And it's always fun. And solunacomputing.com is where you can go for our resources and get all of that content. We're also on YouTube. We've got a company page there and lots of great videos. You can see some of our facilities, meet our teams, and look at some of the new projects that we're working on. So we invite everyone to come and hang out with us and let us know what's happening. I'm at J Belizaire, CEO on Twitter as well.
Awesome. So for the final question, I asked this at the end of all of the conversations is, what is one thing you believe to be true that the majority of people would disagree with you on?
That's a great question. I would say that a lot of my friends who I talk to, I go to cocktail parties and whatnot, and they fundamentally believe that Bitcoin has no value. Why does it have value? What's its role? Like it seems useless to me. Yeah, it's great that the price has come down because it actually doesn't do anything. And 5 years ago, I would argue vehemently against that. These days, I just tell them, just wait and see if that's true. Time will tell. And the reason is because I believe Bitcoin has value because it has, for the first time, created a way to digitize effectively the concept of money. And money has a broad meaning, right? It's an asset that can move around the world. If you're one of over 100 million people on the African continent that aren't happy with their governments, they don't trust them, and they need to find a way to protect their life savings, and they're not going to put a bunch of gold in a bag and try to run across the continent with it. They now have a universal way to move, those earnings and assets into a place that can be, sent all around the world in 10 minutes or less. And that is an incredible achievement. And I don't think that has no value. It has a lot of value, and we should wait and see.
That's an incredible answer. Thank you so much for coming on to this episode. This has been a lot of fun, and we'll definitely have to do it again sometime.
Thanks for having me on the show, and I really appreciate you as well.